just a little bit about our firm. We have a display up in the next room for after the lecture, where you can see our firm is sort of double-sided. We have our high-end custom residential part of the firm, where we do a lot of custom residential work. And then, as I like to joke, we have the other side of the firm that's our hardcore preservation. And sometimes the two meet in a historic residence. And so you can see that dichotomy that's in our firm in the display in the next room. For this lecture, I really have to start with a thanks to Mick Kalarko. Mick did his master's thesis on modern era adobes and setting a context for them in Southern California in 2008. And I was fortunate enough to be his thesis advisor because of all of the adobe work that I do. And so a lot of this, a number of the images, the black and white images that come later in the story are from Mick's thesis. So let me start with what this lecture is not. It is not an exhaustive list of the adobes in La Jolla or the people involved in constructing in adobes. As a matter of fact, I think I would expect at the end of this lecture that easily a dozen more adobes will be brought to my attention by people who just happen to be here in the audience and know of one. It's funny, once your eyes are open to these, you start spotting them everywhere. I was literally picking up the dog from the groomers and walked into a building I've walked into a dozen times. And all of a sudden went, oh my God, this is an adobe. You know where the West End bar is down at the end of La Jolla Boulevard? As you turn? It's either a slump block out of concrete, trying to sort of look like a faux adobe, or it's an adobe. It's one of the two, and I couldn't exactly chip off the paint and look. People sort of look at you askance for that. So anyways, but what this lecture is an examination of the history and material and characteristics of adobe as it starts, and then it goes into how it's evolved in architecture and how that evolution has been seen in examples in La Jolla. And so that's sort of our lecture outline. So a little bit of background. Adobe mud blocks are one of the oldest and most widely used building materials, dating back to 8000 BC. Material's been in continuous use, and over again it finds its promoters because it's cheap, it's easily made, and it has good thermal properties. What's sort of interesting is to see the distribution of earthen architecture around the world. And you'll see that there's this belt that comes right through here. And then it comes down the coast here as well. Now, remember where you're seeing these, because you'll see another slide in a moment that'll tie to this. But about 3 billion people in 6 continents live or work in buildings constructed of earth. And there's lots of different construction methods. Here's an example of rammed earth. Here's someone having blocks handed up to them. So about 30% of the world's population live in earth-made construction. Approximately 50% of the population in developing countries, including the majority of the rural population, and at least 20% of the urban and suburban population live in earthen structures. It's amazing how prevalent it is in other parts of the world compared to the United States. By and large, it's also mainly low-income rural populations that use this type of construction. What the wheel shows is all the different ways that earthen construction is made, because it's not just adobe. Adobe is what we see prevalently here from the Southwest experience and from the Spanish, but adobe actually can be applied like wattle and daub onto a stick structure that's woven. Formed is where we have the a form of molding, poured, extruded, molded, and that's where we get our family of adobe. So this is the one that I wanted you to remember. So part of the problem with where adobes land is that they also happen to land in the exact same belt that's earthquake issues and down the coast. Isn't that interesting? What actually has been found through studies at the Getty Institute, just done in the last 4 years, is that with a good thickness to height ratio and with the simplest ties at the top of the walls, earthquake adobes can be well stabilized for earthquake. But you do have examples of what happened in Peru just a couple years ago. Of course, that's an older building, never was stabilized for earthquakes. They've been well studied. We know exactly what every crack in an adobe usually means in terms of where the seismic pressures have come from and what's been happening, whether it's overturning, fractures at openings, cross cracks at corners, diagonal corner cracks. They all sort of have a meaning. This horizontal one or this completely vertical ones are the scariest, because that means things are really failing in there. So when we make adobe, really, really basic steps to make sure that you have the right content of clay and silt and sand. A simple shake jar test where you put the material you're going to look at in with some water, shake it, let it sit, and then it settles out for you. And you can see with this you have 1/3 soil and 2/3 water. And then there you get your 20% of silt and 80% maximum of sand, and that gives you your test. And then there's an adhesion cohesion test, which is simple as making a snake of clay. And if it goes a certain length, it's good. If it goes longer or shorter, it's bad, and then you adopt it as needed. And then you can take your mixture, mix it in simple tubs. Later, people were using, cement mixers, and you pack it into your form, and you move on. You wet the forms first, and then you sling that adobe into that mold. You pack it in as hard as you can. And these are experts at work, and there's a non-expert. And then you let them dry, you take them out of the mold, you tip them sideways, 21 days later in the sun, you're done. And then adobe is not meant, true old-fashioned adobe, we'll be talking later about stabilized adobe, but true just mud and straw is not meant to be left exposed to the elements. It has to have a sacrificial layer on it, which is usually done with either mud or lime plaster. And once again, you've got your expert and your not so expert flinging the plaster on. So what happens, and the reason you see a lot of deterioration in adobe is because it doesn't get that sacrificial layer of mud and then lime whitewash put on every year. There was a reason why there were 10 kids in a family. You had to keep going out there and re-mudding the outside of that and re-whitewashing it every year. So even just the elements, rain comes in, the water soaks in, it tries to evaporate out. Soluble salts migrate to the surface, they expand and they push the surface layer of the adobe out, and then you start getting some concaving happening. And then in our modern approach, we see this concave, which can also occur from rising damp from too much water in the soil around it. And we say, ooh, there's a hole, let's put concrete in that hole to help it, because that's a better material than the adobe. Well, it's not, unfortunately. It doesn't allow the adobe to breathe. And so instead, the water goes up even higher in the wall to come out, and then the caving just starts happening higher up again. And then there's other issues. These are holes drilled in an adobe out in the Anza Borrego by bees. These are solitary agricultural bees, really. There is no queen. I couldn't move the queen bee to get the nest to no longer find this building appetizing. But what we did do was we drilled holes, condos, for the bees in wood, and we put them on stakes about 20 feet to 300 feet away, starting to migrate them away. We put a cover over the building so it was no longer a nice warm surface. It became a little colder, and they had these nice warm pre-drilled holes, and it has worked. They moved out, but it took a bit. And then this is a little hard to see, but everybody remember Casa de Bandini? Yeah, well, these were the rodent holes. That's a doorway, just to give this perspective. These were the rodent holes behind the kitchen walls. Yeah, one of my employees would not eat Mexican again. It took a while. Okay, so this is how mud and lime plaster works on an adobe wall. What's great about mud and lime plaster is that it breathes. So that as moisture comes into the wall, because it happens, it has the ability to breathe and leave the building. Unfortunately, again, with our modern improvements, we tend to put a cementitious stucco on the outside of the adobe, and that gets us nowhere. All it does is trap the water in here, and I've seen this turn to literally mud soup, because the moisture content just rises and rises and rises, and then you start seeing these bulges down both sides of the wall, and it's because the wall's just literally sinking under its own weight. So the first thing, if you see an adobe with concrete, is get a jackhammer and start taking it off. So here's a historic continuum of adobes that I've had the good fortune to work on with my firm. Starting in the Spanish-Mexican period, I broke the 1800 mark, 1794. Didn't think I'd do that in California. Other parts of the country, you can do that pretty easily. So I've had the good fortune of working on two neophyte structures up near the San Juan Capistrano mission. And then the Casa de Bandini in Old Town, the Casa de Estudillo, the Casa de Machado y Stewart, all in Old Town. Werner Carrillo Ranch House up at Werner's Ranch, off of S2 as you're going off to Borrego. You'll drive right past it, and it's currently being restored. It should be opened in about 4 months. The Santa Margarita Ranch House at Camp Pendleton. And then here is where we sort of cross into the American period with California statehood. And then we're into the Johnson Taylor Adobe, Wing C, the Sykes Adobe Farmstead, which is out at San Diego River Park, just off of the 15. The Bailey Earthen Structure, which is Enza Borrego. The Monarchy Barn, which is at Los Penasquitos. The Torrey Pines State Park, I'm just starting the Historic Structures report on that. It is an adobe. And then the Black Residence, UCSD's University House. So we have some adobes clear through 1951 that we've worked on. It's an interesting material. It just keeps popping up and popping up over and over again. Here you go, just to start seeing how things were built when. Here's an example with the Montanez Adobe, 1794. We had a rubble foundation, a rammed earthen floor, which is this, which we restored and brought back. 2 wide thick walls. So the walls were 24 inches, and the adobe blocks were double wide thick. So a nice, good, thick wall there. Although I have to say this is one of the thinnest walls for the pre-1900 adobes at only 24 inches, but it is a good thickness. It had mud plaster with whitewash and a very smooth, slightly undulating surface. Then we have the Casa de Bandini in Old Town, and this is a drawing of what the Casa de Bandini actually looked like before it got the second story, before it became the Hotel Cosmopolitan, which you guys might be familiar with. This is the 1827 building that is buried on the first floor underneath all of what was Diane Powers, Casa de Bandini, and then the current Hotel Cosmopolitan. Here we were doing excavation with archaeologists, And we could find the actual rubble foundations of the cross walls. So we knew that there was a cross wall that was missing here in that room based on finding these footings in place. Again, this adobe is very traditional in design. It has that U shape. It had 31 to 46 inch thick walls. The rubble foundation, a traditionally smooth exterior surface, because you got to keep that adobe protected, with mud plaster and lime whitewash. And there's the Hotel Cosmopolitan, and as many of you know, the restoration, rehabilitation of it looks very much like this today. Right next door is the Casa de Estadio, and actually Hazel Waterman, a locally famous female architect, did a restoration on the Casa de Estadio in 1910, I want to say. There, the walls are 30 to 42 inches thick. We have a rubble foundation that was later reinforced with concrete. But what's interesting is these are pictures from the Hazel B. Waterman restoration. This is all that was left because nobody was whitewashing it or taking care of it. And these are all their blocks sitting out there for their 21 days to bake in the sun. And here are the laborers. And the specifications that Hazel wrote specified that she wanted Mexican laborers only working on the building, that they were the only ones that had the true hand and eye to know how to build it correctly. And so one of the things is that a loss of whitewash historically signals problems with a household. That either the building's abandoned, there's not enough money, something's going on. So a lot of historians, when they're looking at photos of Old Town, they'll track what's going on, you know, even from a distance at a building by how much whitewash is still on the building. You know, and if whitewash is coming and going, then we know, okay, they're annually maintaining it, or, you know, maintaining it every few years. If it just keeps going darker, 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 something's up. So I want you to keep this faux rustication in mind because you're going to see it again. But in the 1970s, the state parks, in all of its wisdom at the time, and it was because of what people were seeing later, and I'll show you, thought that smooth, undulating plaster like this was not the right finish for an adobe, that obviously adobes had this ripple finish to it. And they actually came in and sandblasted in with a thin nozzle these lines. And the lines actually don't even follow the actual mortar lines of the brick beds. But they're gradually bringing everything back to here. And so this is a nice slide showing, as they have the wherewithal, State Parks is going around the building and bringing it back to what it should be. This is the Warner Carrillo Ranch, 1849. This is where 100,000 immigrants over the course of the gold rush came through this valley and past this building. It's estimated that up to 10,000 people were camping in this valley for a week at a time because this was the first high grass valley that they hit after they crossed the desert, and they could recharge their mules and everything. And the miners wrote about it in their diaries all the time, and they complained that Warner was charging exorbitant fees for flour and bacon. We're in the process of stabilizing it, but it's characteristic of a lot of rural adobes as opposed to the urban ones that had that nice U shape and created an inner courtyard, you know, away from the urban life. Out here in the rural environments, you get a lot of these square adobes. Again, no one was whitewashing the barn, but they were keeping the house up. So it had 24-inch thick walls for the Mexican era portion of the adobe, but as you start getting into the American era in this building, the walls get thinner and thinner and thinner, which isn't good for adobe. That height to width ratio that helps me for seismic, I start losing it. Gable roof is very typical, minimal roof overhangs and that smooth undulating mud plaster and lime whitewash. So here you can see well maintained at this shot. We believe this shot to be about 1911 based on the car. And then here we go, we're losing it. We're losing it right through here. And then you can see this one just got bigger and this one got bigger, and then you get to here. This is a great building in terms of showing examples of basal erosion, those salts pushing out constantly, somebody adding concrete along here and just moving it up higher and higher. And then what this one's really good for is right there, and I'm not sure if my next slide will show it, but literally someone came in and they put cementitious mortar around the adobe instead of setting the adobe in mud mortar. And so you have a differential of expansion between the concrete and the adobe, and it just literally crumbles the block, crumbles the block, crumbles the block. Because it's like a girdle around it. There you go. So that differential expansion coefficient just will literally eat away those blocks. Cement's not their friend in that location. Sykes Adobe Farmstead. Now here we go, American era adobe, and my walls are now only 12 inches thick. And the American forgot the rubble foundation. It's literally dirt blocks on top of dirt. So I have no water barrier that the rubble foundation creates as a place where I can lose some water to evaporation as it's trying to come up through the rocks. It goes out through the holes around the rocks. And instead, it's just wicked right up in this building. Now, unfortunately, we went through the Witch Creek fire. And this is all that was left, was the adobe portion. But thank goodness for insurance money and the city of San Diego's foresight. And we just did the grand opening last June, the grand opening, because we restored it once and had an opening in '04, and then we got to go back again last year for another grand opening and rebuilding it a few times. So here we have basically a very, very thin wall. When clay is baked, it becomes a brick. So here we had the unbaked adobe going through a fire. And so it basically became brick. That's why that's so red in color. And so then I ended up with this very softly baked exterior, like a crust of bread, on the building. But it was only 12 inches thick. And it was flaking off because it wasn't adhering to anything. The soft core underneath was expanding at a different rate. It was sending the baked part in sheets off of it. So it had gone down to like 10 inches thick, 9 inches thick. Plus, the fire burned out all of the wood, so my wood lintels were burned away. And so I had adobe that would collapse in. That one luckily held. The wood was burned out, but for some reason, I don't know, it didn't forget and it just stood. So that was very labor intensive to bring that adobe back and replaster it layer by layer. You have to let each layer dry and let it adhere before you can do the next. You can't go too quickly with adobe. This is another little baby, my forlorn. This is the one that the bees were attacking. This is actually of unknown earthen construction type. It is not made out of block. There are a couple of lift lines, very faintly can be seen in the face of some of the walls, but we honestly are stumped. And sometimes you just have to say, okay, we're stumped. We know how to repair it, we know how to take care of it, but we're not going to be able to figure out exactly how this one was built. This one was sort of fun because it was built in 1905 by Olin Bailey, and he was actually an engineer on some of the railroad lines. So he was starting to implement here some ideas of modern construction, and he actually embedded at the top, like a very first bond beam, he used barbed wire. And so there's 2 to 3 strands of barbed wire that are just sort of running in the top there that are supposed to sort of help it, like a shoestring, hold it together at the top. And then he did a few anchor bolts because he thought about tying the roof to the walls. Most adobes, they just sort of sit there by gravity until I get to them and I actually tie them down. But he thought about it. So it's sort of sweet. And that's him and his mule and a couple of visitors. But American era, fairly thin walls, just 17 inches thick. And then we're starting to get more modern. Here we are in 1922, the Torrey Pines State Parks Visitors Lodge. I'm sorry, that's a dark slide. Requa and Jackson were the architects for it. And some of you, I'm sure, know Richard Requa's name, famous local architect. John Byers was actually brought down to be the Adobe contractor on the project. And he was doing a lot of Adobe in Santa Monica and writing in all these newspaper articles and everywhere about how wonderful this material was. He was a real big promoter of the material. Interesting, here we are about 15 years later, and after Hazel Waterman's Estudillo project. And once again, the specifications call out for Mexican labor because that's the only people who really are going to be able to build this. We do know that the block was manufactured on site for this adobe, and that it was Mexican laborers, although it was erroneously listed as Native Americans. And but what we're unsure of, and what part of my historic structures report is going to be looking at, is whether the block had any stabilizing material in it. About this time, you start stabilizing the adobe with either cement or some sort of asphalt emulsion. And then we also have to figure out whether the mortar in this is soft enough so that it's not breaking up the adobe. And there's a picture of that lodge. So you get a lot of people building in adobe and recreating a Pueblo look or a Spanish Revival look at this time in history. But you also get a lot of people building in just wood and stucco and getting this look. And so unless you go up to the building and bang on it and hear whether it's hollow or not, sometimes you really can't tell whether it's adobe or not. So here we go, Popular Science, 1920 and 1937. The mud house comes back. Build your house out of your own backyard. Just dig that up. You got it. So La Jolla is not immune to this movement, and here's where we finally tie to La Jolla. So Philip Barber has a number of, this is a quote, a number of Indian adobe workers making adobe bricks for the new adobe houses which he will erect on his tract. It's an interesting sight to see these native craftsmen ply their trade. And this was in the La Jolla Light. You'll see in a bit, I did find a couple, but I can't tell whether they really date back to 1923 or not. One of them I think I'm pretty positive about. And then we also found in the La Jolla Journal, Michael helped me look for these, Mr. John Nicholson is credited with just completing 2 adobe homes in the Barber tract. And this was also 1923. But unfortunately, no addresses. Yeah, so that's why I said I think I found them, but I don't know. These were more gossip than fact. So then we have pre and post World War II discussions of this additive material that's now going to make adobes fabulous, that you really can use them as much as you want. And here's a little test example. You see they're squirting a hose on their stabilized and then squirting that high-pressured hose on the unstabilized to show that these new mud bricks are waterproof. And this gentleman's holding his hand up showing that this building went through a flood and that the flood was up to his hand and it withstood the flood. Bit 2 adobe is the asphaltic emulsion. Chem adobe is one of the cementitious emulsions. But there was a real do-it-yourself movement here. Less cost, learn how, build your own home now. You guys can do it. And it filled a need. It really filled a need post-World War II for housing because of a lack of materials. And so you see a fair number cropping up at this point all over the place because of that. And that sort of coincided with the second boom that happened in construction in La Jolla. And so I think that's part of the reason why we have a concentration here. Weir Brothers, this lecture wouldn't be complete in San Diego if we didn't talk about Weir Brothers. Jack and Larry in 1947 started their firm together, the Weir Brothers Adobe Construction. They were based in Escondido. And it's sort of interesting, they actually had like an automotive repair shop, and this guy owed them money, and he, instead of paying for it, he said, I have a pile of adobe block in this yard in Del Mar, which you could have in trade for what I owe you. And the guys realized that they weren't going to get paid any other way, so they went and they picked up the block, and that's how they got started. So just a pile of adobes from a field somewhere near the Del Mar Fairgrounds. And then later they became quite famous for, very large homes, but they started building modest ones to begin with. And this is a signature feature of theirs. They put a wagon wheel window in. And once they ran out of the real wagon wheels, they had to start making them because every client wanted one. These are some other nice ones. This is actually Jack Weir, his family, in front of theirs. Together, the brothers built more than 200 adobe residences. And they cite in an interview that was given to Mick that restrictive building codes and a lack of easily available commercial block is what ended their tenure. At first, they were block mixing on site, and they were actually using cow's blood as their binder material. I don't know why cow's blood was better than something else. That one has me a little stumped, but they got it for free, practically. They got it for $5 a barrel from a slaughterhouse in LA. And so, and Jack was figuring that, he most probably only had to pay the $5 because of the barrel. And that really the blood was free, he was buying the barrel. But later they started using emulsified asphalt. And it's really only once you get this weatherproof adobe that you can have this block showing and have that brown look to the buildings and not have your sacrificial layers of the mud and the lime on the buildings. And I think it was taking a look at what these looked like and taking a look at a lot of abandoned adobes that was why state parks got that mistaken impression in the 1970s that this is what adobe should look like, because that was the adobe they were seeing from all of this work that was happening just post-World War II and was still around the block for them. And then later, the Weir brothers, because they were building very large homes, they couldn't possibly mix their block themselves. They were buying block from 4 different companies that were around California: Hans Stumpf, Holly, Cal Adobe, and I can't think of the 4th at the moment. But here's Cal Adobe's block. They were, Lawrence Rutherford was the general contractor. This was his little office that he did it out of. Here are his fields. This was in Escondido. And this block was trucked all around the county for people. And then he started it in 1949, and he had the bright idea in 1950 to create a subdivision where he demanded that you had to use adobe block so that they'd have to buy it from him. And he actually ended up with, it was called Longview Acres, and he ended up with 62 homes. And when I did the Escondido survey for the city of Escondido, I identified that district. We drove up upon it and just went, whoa, what do we have here? And I named it an Adobe thematic district. So now a little closer to home, Adobes in La Jolla. So as Angeles was mentioning, the Adobe Construction Company was at 7441 La Jolla Boulevard. Charles Paxton was the general contractor, and it's listed here in the directory for 4849, and that's the only year it's listed. Michael, I got the lead for 49. Michael took a look in the directories for me, and the year before, he's not listed, and the year after, he's not listed. So we don't know what happened, but out of the Escondido History Center, these are actually drawings attributed to the Adobe Construction Company of La Jolla, where they were obviously doing representations to clients to try and sell their product and their work, with beautiful little vignettes of this is what your fireplace can look like, and your breakfast table can be in front of a window like this, and here's your carport. Very, very much mimicking, I think, if some of you know Cliff May's work with the long, low ranch. But it was the Adobe Construction Company. Again, the floor plan in a skewed U shape here. And then with the carport and a little vignette of what you could have happening inside your new Adobe. Which brings me to the Black residence up in La Jolla Farms. Now, this was designed by an architect from New Mexico, and he hadn't lost the Spanish traditions of thick walls. So we have 2-foot thick walls. William Lumpkins was the architect. It's a very traditional U-shaped design, but if you notice, it's reverse of what the real traditional adobes are. Like Casa de Estudillo, you enter from one of these sides. You don't enter this way. This is supposed to be your private backyard, and he's suddenly flipped and reversed the plan on you so that you're entering through the private part. And so the private becomes the public here. It's an interesting play. We have a concrete slab foundation. Concrete as the foundation that the adobe sits on, and then the adobe up from there is fine. That's the only place concrete is good on an adobe. Any place else, and it breaks the adobe up. But as a base foundation, it's fine. This was built with stabilized block, but it still has the traditional smooth texture on the outside. So if I wasn't the architect on this, and if I wasn't able to go up and knock on the walls, I wouldn't necessarily know that this is a modern era adobe. There'd be no clues, really. All the adobe came from the Holly Adobe Company. Forrest Holly was up in Ramona making the blocks, and here's a little article from the time about the huge Pueblo dwelling rising at La Jolla Farms. It was big for the time. It was 10,000 square feet in 1950, plus all the outside areas. It was estimated at 30,000 bricks. 8 tons of bricks are supposedly lifted in an 8-hour shift by one worker. Now, this is where your math doesn't add up, but it was in the article. Each brick is about 50 pounds, and they lay 400 bricks a day. So here we go looking for our adobes. Now, this is from a La Jolla Sanborn fire map of 1926, but it was updated clear through the 1950s. And you can see they labeled it Adobe. And these are those duplexes that are right there on La Jolla Boulevard and, I'll have a name here in a minute, and Arenas. So this is the one that faces La Jolla Boulevard, and this is the one that faces Arenas. And I apologize that this slide is so dark, but I had to go onto Google to find this image, because unfortunately, in just the last year and a half, I want to say, this is what's happened. It's gone from that exposed block that's just painted, they've stuccoed the whole outside. So you've lost what was the original intention on that one. You can get it back. We can get it back. And then this was another adobe down in the Barber Track. That was, there were 2 adobes, and they split the lot on a diagonal. It was here on Vista de la Playa. And unfortunately, they were demolished, and those are the 2 houses we have in that place, so we've lost those. C Lane is identified here as an adobe, and I believe this is a Richard Requa as well. So I think this is one of the 1920s that could have been what was alluded to in the article. But again, there are thousands of houses that look just like this that are stucco and wood. And unless you have the Sanborn map to identify the adobe, or your permission to go up and knock on the building without making people run to the front door to look at who's banging their building, you don't really know, with that look at least. But with this look, you know. So Charles Macaulay was a designer builder here in La Jolla. He started right after World War II, and this is the building which has been demolished at 750 Bon Air Place, which is right here. I'm so sorry this pixelated. Anyways, Macaulay built this adobe here and this adobe here back to back. This one's still standing, and you'll see it in a minute. This is the adobe that Angeles and I bonded on in 2000 when it was threatened with demolition, and we fought it really hard at the Historic Resources Board, but we lost lost the battle. But you can see it was really a unique one in that it started to cross the line and use adobe with modernist elements. So that you have some really big overhangs, some huge windows. Normally you don't have windows this large in an adobe. And the deep overhangs, it's getting all of those modernist aspects and the long flat roof as opposed to a parapeted wall or a gable roof. He actually only built from 1946 to 1954. His widow, Alice, was kind enough to talk to me on the phone a couple of days ago to get a few more details. And these are a few more of his projects. I think I understand that this one has been demolished, but I didn't have a chance to run by to double check. He got his mud from Eden Gardens out by the Mexican restaurants, Fidel's and et cetera, and he made his own block in a field he owned in Del Mar. Here's the Bon Air Street one that's still standing. And you can see you get this wonderful articulation of the block and the mud and the rustication. So this is where those state parks people got this idea. They're seeing this, 20 years later, 30 years later, and thinking that this is what it's supposed to look like. But the very modern composition, challenging the whole rules of traditional composition with adobes, asymmetric, painted, wide roof eaves, low-pitched roof, large glass expanses. And you can see that undulating rustic block. And as stabilized block, it no longer needs that sacrificial layer, and it can just be painted or left natural. Here's one that's left natural, again, very modernist with this window gable end. Very, very modern. And there it is. It's here in the Barber Track as well on Vista de la Playa. And this is one that's over on Linda Rosa. Again, it's not painted, so you can tell. You can see that characteristic brown color that tells you it's been done with soil, as opposed to the more gray that you'd see with concrete. This is a little one in Bird Rock off of Chelsea. Just a lovely modernist piece. Asymmetrical, clear story windows, large, wide fireplace chimney, big pieces of glass, the overhangs, the low-pitched roof. Just a beautiful example. This one takes a more traditional approach in some respects, however, and you can't really see it through the foliage. This gable has that glass clear story opening. Again, that just makes it, scream that I am modern. I am an adobe, but I am modern with the application of the glass that way. And here you can see their rustic adobe coming up, and even the concrete bond beam at the top is well expressed in the surface material. This one's actually around the corner from my home on Avenida Cresta. And it's this wonderful little corner house with all this stabilized adobe block sitting at the corner. Unfortunately, the Sanborn maps didn't come down this far, so couldn't identify it off of a Sanborn. You just sort of have to know. And then this is one that a couple of builders who had been at my house and then heard I liked adobe told me about most probably 10, 11 years ago. And one of them, I can't remember who it was now, was very proud because he had worked on this and how unique this was. But it was done late. It was done sometime post-1967. It's practically round. I mean, not a shape that it's just, it's not an octagon. It's, I don't know, a 16agon. It's multiple facets going around. So then, how do you distinguish slump concrete, stabilized adobe, and adobe? You really can't. Not unless somebody lets you do a test on it. Pick off a piece, do a particle chemical analysis. You can chip off some of the coloring on it if it's covered, and see if you got your brown color versus your concrete gray. But then you have people who are just batch mixing in their backyard, because remember, you can build this out of the material in your own backyard. So some batches are going to have more concrete in it, and some batches are going to have less concrete in it, and so that might start changing the color more to gray, less to brown. So it's really, because it's this do-it-yourself material, very hard to tie down without a chemical analysis, particle analysis. And you know, most people won't let me just, for this project, go up and take a sample. But sort of like how the state parks people were a little thrown off in how to show their rustication, and this is adobe, so it's supposed to look rustic, as opposed to smooth white and all tailored, and, which it really was originally. People will do this drippy mortar look, but don't let that fool you, because that one actually is cement block, but made to look all drippy and rusticated.
Ione,
Yeah.
could I just ask you a question?
Sure.
Did the state building code, or did the building codes in California start requiring stabilized adobe in the 1960s?
Actually, they started moving towards that in the 1930s, maybe late 20s. Clarence Cullimore out of Bakersfield was heavily involved in rewriting the Uniform Building Code to allow adobe so that it could be FHA funded for homes and get FHA loans. He also started adopting the slab-on-grade concrete footings and suggesting bond beams at the top, and then methods for tying the roof to the walls. So it was sort of all tied together in that modernizing the adobe. And I'm really not sure what it was about the code that changed in the 1960s that the Weir brothers had problems with that made it harder at that point. I don't know. But now we regularly seismically retrofit, you know, 1840s adobes that are on rubble foundation for public use. So it's doable. And then there's a series of houses that I really sort of can't tell you what they are, but I can tell from the outside that they're either wannabe adobes, or they are adobes, or they're slump blocks. But they obviously love the aesthetic, even within the modernist element. Again, large windows, asymmetrical front, even sort of have this projecting eave here, which is quasi-Polynesian. You know, is it concrete slump block or is it adobe? That's over on La Jolla Hermosa, right behind my office. And then right on La Jolla Boulevard, Villa La Jolla, the 6300 block, all of the site walls have that aesthetic, and this main pool house building has the aesthetic on the outside of this undulating block that was, you know, the modern use of adobe, but yet paired with clear story window ribbon and an expression of the structure on the outside of the columns, creating a grid around the exterior. And, you know, and as I was driving around, because I wanted to go get a shot of that almost round house for you guys, I'm driving past Sukasa and I'm like, oh my God, I've never noticed this before. You know, here it is, the parking lot, and it's, you know, adobe-like, entry posts and guardrails for it. So here we go. Good night, thank you. These are confirmed or potential and some demolished adobe residences in La Jolla. And that's the list of a number of them that I found. So, questions? Yes?
Where did Dominic do his research? Where did he get his degree?
Goucher College. He was getting a master's in historic preservation at Goucher.
How did he get teamed up with you?
I think Mel Green, who's a structural engineer and works in Adobe seismic retrofit. He's the consultant to the King of Morocco on earth and structures, and my friend, and picks up the phone when I call. And he was serving as an adjunct professor and connected us together. Yes?
What's your thoughts on paint on Adobe? Is that bad or good?
It needs to breathe. So a latex paint won't let it breathe. An oil paint will. Quite frankly, slackened lime whitewash is the absolute best because you also get a chemical bond that occurs between the earth and the lime. So it adheres well. It wears off, but it does adhere better than paint does. That'll come off in sheets. Yes?
I've got to ask, what are the issues involving living with dirt all around you, spiders and bugs?
Well, with a historic adobe that's rammed earth, you ram the earth really hard. Nothing's coming up through that. They're coming in through the doors and windows just like they would in a wooden house. Okay, and as long as you have everything well sealed and maintained and taken care of, there's no difference there. And actually, Charles Cullimore, when he was trying to promote the adobe use in Bakersfield, was identifying that Bakersfield typically hits about 100 degrees, and that all of his clients inside his adobes, the average temperature was more like 75 to 80 within the adobe. Adobes are very temperate. They hold heat in the winter, and they keep heat out in the summer. And so whenever I'm out at a job site like Warner's Ranch, which is baking in the summer, we just step inside the adobe to finish out the conversation, and immediately it's 20 degrees cooler and just very, very comfortable. And they knew how to site the adobes too. And modern architects know how to do this as well, so that it would catch the breeze. And so through the minimal openings that they did have, you had the nice coolness of the adobe and the breeze. Modern era adobes are slab on concrete, same as many of your wood frame houses. So you're not getting that. The best way to heat an adobe would be with radiant heat, though. With everybody going green and all that, people are getting more interested in adobe as potential material, and with radiant heat as a more efficient form of heating, actually. Yes.
That rammed earth floor, you described it a little bit. Is it emulsified in any way on the surface, or is it just packed?
It is packed, but we actually treated it with linseed oil to help emulsify it a bit and to make it a little waterproof in terms of usage. And being the traditional method that you'd maintain that would be once a week. You'd clear everything out of your adobe and you'd sprinkle water on it, and then you'd sweep it. And it's the sweeping and the use, and then you'd come back in and you'd scatter fresh hay or herbs, and then you'd roll your carpets back out over it. And so that was traditionally actually how it was used. Yes?
To your knowledge, what is the most recently built, what you would consider a true adobe, still existing in Illinois?
With unstabilized block?
And that's why I said that,
Yeah.
you would interpret.
I mean, I would say that, even with stabilized block, it's a true adobe.
I was going to say traditional design, let's put it that
A
way.
traditional design. In La Jolla.
Yep. There's about 20, a couple of dozen there on the screen.
There's not a traditional, that duplex on the corner takes your traditional rectilinear form. That's your most basic start for a family out in the wilderness. They build their one room out of adobe. That's how Sykes started. 2 rooms out of adobe, all in one rectilinear plan. That's how Warner's started. And then from there, as the kids come, you start growing it and growing it and growing it. So, maybe that duplex, just because it's a very clean rectilinear form.
Which one is that on the list?
That's the one at La Jolla Boulevard and Arenas, 473, 469 Arenas. But then go around the corner onto La Jolla Boulevard and you'll see what it really was supposed to look like. Because that's the one that unfortunately got stuccoed and the block isn't showing anymore. Yes?
Two parts to the question are, one, out of Black Horse, I thought the original structure out there was an adobe, like the double wall adobe type structure. And actually, when I think of traditional adobe, I think of double wall type thing.
You know, the black residence that's now the Chancellor's house.
Black Horse, right by UCSD there.
Oh,
Stables
were the stables. Those were the stables.
Exactly. It's a Estancia now.
Yeah,
That was
yeah. There is that up there. I didn't go up there, yeah. I don't know how you get to it anymore.
Is it still there? Well, they said that they used some blocks from it really needed to, the original structures needed to be designated, and they kind of semi-reconstructed it, but it's not.
They are reconstructed,
Okay,
and they are kind of medium homes. They are inside of the complex, so you really don't see it for the public.
yeah. I mean, and the Black House itself is very traditional with the thick walls and the U shape. It's just that it's a reverse floor plan. And it's drawing rather than from the vernacular Spanish gable style, from the more southwest New Mexico Pueblo style. And you get both happening in Adobe. Yes?
When they build the 2-foot or larger wall thickness, do they overlap the blocks or?
You actually overlap in a couple of different directions. You do a running bond within it, and then you also send cross pieces through to interlock the stacks. Okay. Oh, yes.
I was at the Getty Conservation Lab several years ago, and they stated there, they had the shaking table, and they're trying to figure out how to stabilize adobes, et cetera. And they said that at the time they were doing the research, nobody understood why the properties of mud and what makes a good adobe versus a not good adobe. And that they were teaming up with some engineers at a university in France to take a look at the chemical composition of mud and make some determinations of what mud works really well and what isn't. So do you know if that research has been completed and what did we find out?
I actually don't know if that research has been completed, but I was poking around their website recently. Unfortunately, they say, here we are in English, press the little British flag symbol, and then it only translates 3 out of the 30 articles. And my French is okay, but not technical. So, and I didn't have time to put it into a translator to see whether any of those titles that they were showing, but I was curious about following that up as well. Yeah.
On a newer house, how would they put in the electrical and the water lines? Where do those go?
You actually dig runs into the adobe and then you plaster over it, or bring it up through the slab below, are the two traditional methods. There's always an issue then that metal conduit doesn't do well in adobe because of the moisture content and it starts to rust. So then you have to start looking at plastic to run your wires through and things like that. Just you have to play with the nature of the material. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Pat?
I have a question. What would you suggest to see that how to treat the adobe kiln down in Pottery Canyon? It's now wrapped in black tar, and I know that that's not good for it.
Well, I mean, it's okay if you're definitely keeping all moisture out of it and nothing's coming up from below and getting trapped under that adobe tarp, that black tarp. And as long as the tarp doesn't have any holes in it, that anything's coming through it on top. But really the best thing is, it depends upon what your preservation plan is for it. If you want to arrest the decay in place, then don't rebuild it, but start giving it its sacrificial layers on it. And going back every year or two and replacing the sacrificial layers on it. If you're ready to rebuild it, You figure out what's structurally key, you rekey in new pieces, and then you start doing your sacrificial layers again. You can't get away from those sacrificial layers. You've got to have them. Traditional Adobe. Thank you so much. Come up later.